Good evening and welcome to my channel. United Arab Emirates just publicly declared that its territory and military bases will absolutely not be used to launch attacks against Iran, despite facing sustained Iranian missile and drone strikes on Emirati soil that have killed civilians and destroyed infrastructure, creating unprecedented diplomatic crisis where UAE is refusing American demands to participate in military operations, even though Washington has provided security guarantees and military protection for 75 years. While Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, close Trump ally, issued extraordinary threats warning that Gulf states refusing to join American war effort will face serious consequences, including potential withdrawal of U.S. military protection, leaving them defenseless against Iranian retaliation, proving that decades-old American alliance system in Middle East is collapsing in real time, as regional partners calculate that aligning with Washington's Iran war creates more danger than benefit, forcing them to choose between American pressure and their own survival. 75 years. That is how long United States has maintained military alliances with Gulf monarchies, providing security umbrella that allowed small, oil-rich states to exist independently despite being surrounded by larger, potentially hostile powers. But now, UAE Ambassador Jamal al-Musharakh, standing before United Nations in Geneva, explicitly stating that UAE does not seek to be drawn into conflict or escalation, and Emirati bases are not being used to conduct operations against Iran, represents fundamental rejection of American demands that allied nations contribute to military campaigns, regardless of whether those nations support a decision to go to war in first place. And Lindsey Graham's response, threatening consequences for Gulf states that refuse participation, reveals extraordinary American arrogance, where Washington assumes it can compel allies to fight wars they oppose through threats of abandonment, creating resentment that is destroying alliance relationships built over three-quarters of a century. This is not minor diplomatic disagreement. This is potential end of American security architecture in Gulf region, where oil-producing monarchies that Washington depends on for energy supplies and military basing are openly defying American demands and accepting risks of doing so because they have concluded that fighting Iran alongside America is more dangerous than refusing American pressure and seeking independent accommodation with Tehran. Let me explain exactly what UAE is saying and why this represents catastrophic failure of American alliance management. Because when closest regional partner publicly refuses to support American military operations, this signals to other allies that defying Washington is possible and potentially preferable to blind obedience that leads to national destruction. UAE is not peripheral American partner, but core Gulf ally, hosting Al Dhafra Air Base, where American forces operate advanced aircraft including F-35 stealth fighters, tanker aircraft enabling long-range bomber missions, reconnaissance platforms gathering intelligence across region, and command facilities coordinating operations throughout Middle East, making Emirati cooperation essential for American military effectiveness. Additionally, UAE has purchased tens of billions of dollars in American weapons systems over decades, including F-16 fighters, Patriot air defense missiles, Apache helicopters, and sophisticated surveillance equipment, creating deep military integration where Emirati forces operate American platforms, and American advisors train Emirati personnel, establishing relationships that typically ensure political alignment during conflicts. But despite this extensive military relationship, and despite UAE facing direct Iranian attacks on its territory, including Dubai airport strike that killed civilians and disrupted global aviation hub, Emirati government is categorically refusing to allow American forces to use UAE bases for attacks on Iran. Ambassador al-Musharakh's statement emphasizes that UAE is being targeted in very unwarranted manner, implying that Iranian strikes on Emirati territory are unjustified, but simultaneously refusing to retaliate or support American retaliation, suggesting UAE views Iranian attacks as regrettable consequences of regional conflict rather than acts of war requiring military response. This represents fundamentally different threat assessment than American position, which treats any Iranian attack as intolerable aggression, demanding overwhelming retaliation. UAE's call for urgent reduction in tensions and return to diplomatic dialogue directly contradicts American strategy of military pressure, attempting to force Iranian capitulation, proving that closest American allies in region completely disagree with Washington's approach, believing diplomacy, not escalation, is appropriate response to crisis. When your most important regional partner publicly advocates opposite policy from what you are pursuing, this indicates catastrophic failure of alliance coordination, where partners' interests have diverged so dramatically that continued cooperation becomes impossible. Lindsey Graham's threats of consequences for Gulf states refusing to join war represent extraordinary diplomatic overreach, because threatening allies typically destroys relationships rather than compelling compliance. Graham is Republican senator from South Carolina and extremely close Trump ally who speaks regularly with President and often articulates administration positions before official White House statements, making his warnings credible indicators of actual American policy rather than freelance political rhetoric. Graham's specific threat that Gulf states will face consequences if they do not join American strikes against Iran reveals assumption that allies exist solely to serve American interests and have no legitimate right to make independent decisions about their own security and foreign policy. This colonial mentality where Washington treats sovereign nations as subordinate entities required to obey American commands regardless of their own interests perfectly explains why alliance system is collapsing, because no self-respecting nation will accept permanent subordination to foreign power, especially when that foreign power's decisions threaten national survival. Most concerning aspect of Graham's threat is implication that consequences could include withdrawal of American military protection, leaving Gulf states defenseless against Iranian retaliation. For 75 years, American security guarantee has been cornerstone of Gulf monarchy survival, allowing small nations with tiny populations to maintain independence despite being surrounded by larger powers, including Iran, Iraq historically, and Saudi Arabia. If United States withdraws protection, these small states become extremely vulnerable to external pressure, potentially forcing them into Iranian sphere of influence or requiring accommodation with regional powers that Washington opposes. But Graham's threat assumes Gulf states still value American protection more than they fear American entanglement in wars that provoke Iranian attacks. UAE's defiance suggests this calculation has reversed, where Emirati leadership believes refusing American demands and seeking diplomatic settlement with Iran provides better security than hosting American bases that make UAE target for Iranian missiles. If UAE can negotiate understanding with Tehran, guaranteeing Emirati neutrality in exchange for Iran ceasing attacks on Emirati territory, this provides more reliable security than American promises to defend against Iranian strikes that American air defenses demonstrably cannot stop completely. This creates a devastating problem for American strategy, because if Gulf allies conclude they are safer accommodating Iran than hosting American forces, entire American military presence in region becomes untenable as countries request American withdrawal to avoid becoming targets. Already, UAE is experiencing this dynamic where Iranian strikes hit Emirati territory because Tehran views UAE as American proxy, supporting attacks on Iran. If UAE can end Iranian strikes by declaring neutrality and requesting American departure, rational self-interest dictates choosing survival over alliance loyalty. UAE's specific statement that Emirati bases are not being used to conduct operations against Iran suggests that American forces may have been planning or attempting to use Al Dhafra Air Base for strike missions that UAE government has blocked, creating operational constraints on American military campaign. If bombers cannot refuel at Emirati bases, this extends flight times and reduces sortie rates. If reconnaissance aircraft cannot operate from UAE, this creates intelligence gaps. If command facilities cannot use Emirati infrastructure, this complicates coordination across theater. These operational limitations force American military to rely more heavily on other bases, including those in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and potentially Jordan, each of which faces similar political pressures to avoid becoming targets for Iranian retaliation. If multiple Gulf states simultaneously restrict American basing access, Pentagon's ability to conduct sustained operations against Iran degrades dramatically, potentially forcing acceptance of military objectives less ambitious than total Iranian capitulation that Trump demands. Regional implications extend far beyond UAE because other Gulf states are watching closely to see whether defying American pressure brings catastrophic consequences or whether Washington tolerates allied defiance because alternatives are worse. Saudi Arabia, despite Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's reported private encouragement of Trump to attack Iran, is also experiencing Iranian missile strikes on Saudi territory, creating domestic pressure to avoid deeper involvement. If Saudi leadership observes UAE successfully maintaining neutrality without suffering American punishment, Riyadh might similarly restrict American basing access. Qatar hosts enormous Al Udeid Air Base with over 10,000 American personnel, making it most important American military facility in Middle East. But Qatari government maintains diplomatic relationships with Iran, including sharing North Dome South Pars gas field, creating incentives to avoid complete break with Tehran. If Qatar follows UAE example and restricts offensive operations from Qatari territory, American air campaign loses critical infrastructure. Bahrain hosts U.S. Fifth Fleet Naval Headquarters but has majority Shia population that is politically marginalized by Sunni monarchy, creating internal tensions that government must manage carefully. If Bahraini leadership perceives Iranian attacks as consequence of hosting American forces, domestic pressure could force restrictions on American naval operations from Bahraini ports. Kuwait already experienced Iranian missile strike, destroying American runway at Ali al-Salam Air Base, demonstrating vulnerability of hosting American forces. If Kuwaiti government concludes that neutrality provides better protection than American alliance, restrictions on American basing access would follow. This cascading defection from American alliance could create situation where Pentagon lacks adequate regional infrastructure to sustain operations, forcing acceptance of ceasefire terms or withdrawal from conflict despite military advantages. American military power requires forward bases, logistics support, intelligence cooperation, and host nation permissions to function effectively in expeditionary campaigns. If regional nations collectively withdraw cooperation, American forces must either withdraw or operate at dramatically reduced effectiveness. Historical parallels exist in Philippines' decision to close American military bases in 1991, ending nearly a century of American military presence after Filipino Senate voted not to renew bases agreement. American officials warned Philippines would lose security protection and suffer strategic disadvantage, but Filipino nationalism and resentment of American military presence outweighed security concerns. Subsequently, Philippines navigated regional security environment without American bases, though later invited limited American military cooperation under different arrangements. Similar dynamics could emerge in Gulf, where nationalist resentment of American military presence combines with calculation that American protection creates more danger than security, forcing regional governments to request American departure despite security risks. If Gulf states collectively decide they are better off without American bases, Washington loses entire regional infrastructure that enables global power projection into Middle East, Central Asia, and potentially Africa. American military planning assumes access to Gulf bases as permanent strategic asset that can be relied upon for any contingency, from Iranian threats to Russian expansion to Chinese influence. But if this assumption proves false and regional nations exercise sovereignty by denying American access, Pentagon must fundamentally rethink global force posture, potentially requiring increased reliance on carrier groups, which are more expensive and less capable than land-based operations. Economic implications are equally significant because American energy security depends partly on Gulf oil production and export through Strait of Hormuz that American military supposedly guarantees. But if Gulf states believe American military presence makes them targets rather than protecting them, they may seek security arrangements with other powers, including China, which is already a major trading partner and increasingly important security relationship for Saudi Arabia and UAE. China does not offer military guarantees comparable to American security umbrella, but also does not demand Gulf states join Chinese military operations that provoke enemies, making Chinese partnership potentially more attractive than American alliance that requires participation in wars that create Iranian retaliation. If Gulf states pivot toward Chinese economic and security relationships while distancing from American military partnerships, this represents major geopolitical shift, undermining American influence across region. Trump administration's response to UAE defiance will determine whether alliance crisis escalates or stabilizes. If Washington follows through on Graham's threats, withdrawing military protection and imposing consequences, this could accelerate Gulf states' search for alternative security arrangements, possibly including rapprochement with Iran. But if Trump accepts UAE neutrality without severe punishment, this establishes precedent that allies can defy American demands without catastrophic consequences, encouraging other nations to assert independence. Either outcome represents strategic setback for American influence because alliance relationships based on coercion rather than shared interests are inherently fragile, and declining American ability to compel allied compliance reveals diminishing power that adversaries will exploit. If America cannot convince closest allies to support military operations, this signals weakness that emboldens challenges from China, Russia, and Iran, who observe that American alliance system is fracturing under pressure. Diplomatic community reaction will focus on UAE's reasonable position, advocating de-escalation and negotiations rather than military escalation that could engulf entire region in conflict. European nations will likely support Emirati calls for diplomatic solution because European economies cannot sustain oil shocks from expanded Gulf conflict, making UAE's diplomatic position more internationally acceptable than American military maximalism. United Nations Security Council debates about Iran crisis will feature UAE and other Gulf states advocating ceasefire and negotiations, potentially putting them in alignment with China and Russia against American position, demanding Iranian capitulation, creating unusual diplomatic coalition where American allies join American adversaries in opposing Washington's preferred policy. This diplomatic isolation compounds military challenges because if international consensus forms around ceasefire and negotiations rather than continued military pressure, Trump administration faces pressure from allies, partners, and international institutions to accept settlement terms that fall short of total victory, undermining domestic political narrative that military campaign is succeeding. UAE's moral position is stronger than American position because Emiratis are actual victims of Iranian attacks, losing civilians and infrastructure, yet still advocating diplomatic resolution rather than military revenge, demonstrating restraint that compares favorably to American approach of massive retaliation. International public opinion will likely sympathize with UAE's victimhood and diplomatic wisdom rather than American demands that allies join bombing campaign. Subscribe to this channel immediately because UAE's defiance of American demands represents potential collapse of 75-year alliance system with catastrophic implications for American power projection, requiring expert analysis of strategic consequences. Hit subscribe and enable notifications for continued coverage of alliance crisis. Before you leave, critical question. Is UAE making smart strategic choice prioritizing survival over alliance loyalty or catastrophic mistake that will leave Emirates vulnerable when American protection withdraws? Drop A, B, or C. A. Smart choice. American alliance creates more danger than protection. UAE safer negotiating with Iran. B. Catastrophic mistake. Without American protection, UAE is vulnerable. Should maintain alliance despite risks. C. Forced choice. UAE has no good options between American pressure and Iranian threats. Choose least bad. Comment your assessment with detailed reasoning because community analysis shapes coverage. Ensure you are subscribed with notifications because alliance crisis is developing rapidly. Day 11. UAE refuses American demands to join Iran attacks. Ambassador al-Musharakh states Emirati bases not being used for Iran strikes. UAE calls for de-escalation and diplomatic dialogue. Lindsey Graham threatens consequences for Gulf states refusing to join war, implies withdrawal of American protection, 75-year alliance potentially collapsing, UAE experiencing Iranian strikes but still refuses retaliation or supporting American operations, fundamental disagreement with American military strategy, other Gulf states watching UAE example, potential cascading defection from American alliance, operational implications if multiple states restrict basing access, regional infrastructure essential for American power projection, historical parallels to Philippines base closures, economic implications if Gulf states pivot toward China, diplomatic isolation as allies advocate ceasefire while America demands escalation, international sympathy for UAE position. Trump administration must decide response to allied defiance. Either outcome represents strategic setback. Subscribe now. Enable notifications. Drop A, B, or C with reasoning. I will see you in next update as crisis accelerates.